Was it a desperate act to save a republic, or the greatest political miscalculation in human history? And how is it possible that a conspiracy involving more than 60 of Rome's most prominent senators, men known for their egos, their ambitions, and their inability to keep a secret, could come to fruition in the heart of the world's most gossipy city without a single leak? The story of the assassination of Gaius Julius Caesar is not just about a murder. It is about a moment when a single act of violence tore a hole in reality, and through that hole poured a future no one, least of all the assassins, could have ever imagined. It begins not with a dagger, but with a color, purple. The color of kings, a color that was beginning to cling to Caesar like a second skin. And in Rome, the scent of a king was indistinguishable from the scent of poison. After his victories in Gaul, in Egypt, in Spain, and finally over his Roman rivals at Pharsalus, Caesar had returned not as a mere general, but as a living deity. His triumphs were no longer simple military parades, they were celestial events. For 4 days, the city choked on the smoke of sacrifices and the roar of adoring crowds. He celebrated victories over Gauls, Egyptians, Pontus, and even fellow Romans, though the last was tactfully disguised as a victory over a foreign king. But the senators watching from their marble seats saw the truth. He wasn't just celebrating victory over Rome's enemies, he was celebrating his victory over Rome itself. The honors piled up until they became grotesque. A statue of Caesar was placed in the temple of Quirinus with the inscription, "To the Invincible God." His image was paraded with those of the gods during sacred processions. His birth month, Quintilis, was renamed Julius, or July as we still call it. He was granted the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. And then the ultimate prize, the one that broke the back of the old republic, Dictator Perpetuo. Dictator for life. The title itself was a contradiction, a constitutional monstrosity. A dictator was a temporary emergency measure, a position held for 6 months to save the state. A dictator for life was simply a king without a crown, and every Roman was taught from childhood the story of Lucius Junius Brutus, the ancestor of one of the future assassins, who had driven out the last king, Tarquin the Proud, 5 centuries earlier. The hatred of kings was in their blood, it was the foundational myth of their freedom. Now, here was a man who walked like a king, talked like a king, and ruled like a king, all while smiling and insisting he was merely the Republic's humble servant. The Roman aristocrats didn't fear that Caesar would become a king, they feared he would make them obsolete, turning the Senate from the heart of power into a decorative advisory board for his own absolute will. The fear was palpable. It thickened the air in the private villas on the Palatine Hill, where senators gathered at night, the flicker of oil lamps catching the nervous sweat on their brows. They spoke in hushed tones, but their words were of daggers. They saw Caesar's ambition as a disease, and they were the surgeons who had to cut it out before it consumed the entire body of the Republic. Provocations, both real and staged, became daily theatre. Someone placed a royal diadem on one of Caesar's statues on the rostra. The tribunes, loyal to the old ways, promptly had it removed and arrested the men responsible. Caesar, in a calculated display of public anger and private satisfaction, had the tribunes deposed. He wanted to show he had no royal ambitions, but his punishment of those who defended republican tradition screamed the opposite. He was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push the boundaries before they snapped. The final, unforgivable act came during the festival of Lupercalia, just a month before his death. As Caesar sat on his golden throne, watching the festivities, his most loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony, drunk and clad in the ritual goatskins of the festival, ran into the forum. 3 times, Antony tried to place a laurel wreath intertwined with a royal diadem on Caesar's head. 3 times, Caesar refused, pushing it away as the crowd, carefully seated with his supporters, gave a weak, unconvincing cheer for his humility. But the senators saw it for what it was, a choreographed piece of political theatre, a public opinion poll on the question of monarchy. And the results were not what Caesar had hoped. The silence from the true Romans was deafening. Antony's stunt wasn't a test, it was a death sentence. The conspiracy began to coalesce from dozens of small, resentful streams into a single, deadly river. The leaders were not rabble-rousers or wild-eyed fanatics. They were the elite of the elite, men who believed they were the rightful guardians of Rome. Men like Gaius Cassius Longinus, a brilliant general who nursed a bitter personal grudge against Caesar. Men like Decimus Junius Brutus, one of Caesar's most trusted commanders, who owed his career and his life to the dictator, yet chose to betray him. And many others pardoned enemies of Caesar's who smiled at him in the Senate by day and plotted his death by night. They were a band of rivals, a collection of egos bound together by a common fear. They believed Caesar's death would be a cauterizing wound, a painful but necessary surgery to save the Republic. They thought that by cutting off the head, the body would heal itself and return to its old, familiar ways. It was a spectacular failure of imagination. They could not see that the Republic was already dead. Its heart had stopped beating long ago, during a century of brutal civil wars, of street gangs run by aristocrats, of generals who marched on their own city. Caesar was not the disease, he was a symptom. He was the logical endpoint of a system that had rotted from within. The conspirators, in their noble, self-righteous fury, were about to kill the symptom, oblivious to the fact that the disease itself was terminal and that their cure would be infinitely more horrific than the ailment. They had the daggers, they had the motive, they had the opportunity, but for their righteous act to be seen as liberation, not murder, they needed something more. They needed a name that resonated with the very soul of the Republic, a symbol of the ancient fight against tyranny. They needed a man whose very presence would transform a back alley stabbing into a glorious act of civic virtue. They needed Brutus, Marcus Junius. Brutus carried the weight of his name like a curse. To be a Brutus in Rome was to be a living monument to republican liberty. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, was the man who had supposedly liberated Rome from its last king 500 years before. Now, every morning, as Marcus Brutus walked through the city, he passed the statue of that great ancestor, standing proud and stern in the Capitol, a bronze dagger in his hand. It was a daily reminder of a legacy he could never escape. And recently, the pressure had become unbearable. Anonymous messages began to appear, scrawled on the praetor's chair where he sat to administer justice. "Are you asleep, Brutus?" One read. Another, more cutting, "You are no true Brutus." They were whispers from the ghost of the Republic, goading him, shaming him. What is more damning than being told you are failing to live up to the glory of your own name? This was the battleground where Gaius Cassius Longinus, the true architect of the conspiracy, chose to fight for Brutus's soul. He understood that Brutus was the key. Without him, the plot was just a sordid affair of jealous rivals. With him, it was a crusade. Cassius, a man of sharp intellect and even sharper resentments, began his campaign not with direct appeals to violence, but with subtle, poisonous questions. He would find Brutus in the forum, his face a mask of thoughtful melancholy, and speak of the state of Rome, lamenting the death of freedom, the sycophantic flattery that now passed for senatorial debate. He didn't talk about killing Caesar, he talked about the idea of Caesar, the living embodiment of tyranny that his ancestor had sworn to destroy. Brutus's mind was a tempest. He was a philosopher, a student of the Stoics, a man who believed in reason and virtue above all else. But he was also a man torn by a profound personal conflict. He loved Caesar. The dictator had been a close friend of his mother, Servilia, and their relationship was so intimate that many in Rome whispered Caesar was Brutus's real father. After defeating Brutus's father-in-law, Pompey the Great, at the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar had given specific orders that Brutus was not to be harmed. He had pardoned him, promoted him, and treated him with a paternal affection that was both genuine and politically useful. Could you betray a friend, a benefactor, a man who had shown you nothing but kindness for the sake of an abstract idea? This was the question that haunted Brutus's sleepless nights. He would pace the colonnades of his mansion, the cool night air doing nothing to soothe the fire in his mind. He saw Rome suffocating, its ancient liberties being strangled by the ambitions of one man. Yet that man had saved his life. He owed a debt of loyalty to Caesar, the man, but he also owed a debt to the Republic, the idea. A man's conscience is the most crowded room in the world, especially when his ancestors are shouting, and the ghost of Lucius Junius Brutus was screaming in his ear. Cassius saw this turmoil and exploited it with surgical precision. He brought others to speak with Brutus, senators whose words carried weight, men who framed the choice in stark, philosophical terms. It was not murder, they argued. It was tyrannicide, the highest civic duty. It was not betrayal, but a painful act of patriotism. Slowly, agonizingly, Brutus began to turn. The final push may have come from his wife, Portia, the daughter of the great Stoic and Caesar's most implacable enemy, Cato the Younger. Portia was a woman of formidable intellect and courage. Sensing her husband's torment, she confronted him, demanding to know the secret that was eating him alive. To prove her strength and her worthiness to share in his burden, she secretly stabbed herself in the thigh with a small knife. When Brutus discovered her, bleeding but resolute, she told him she was not merely a woman to share his bed and board, but a partner in his life, capable of enduring pain and keeping secrets. This act of shocking devotion broke through Brutus's final reservations. He confessed everything. With Porcia's support, his resolve hardened. He accepted his role. He would be the leader. Once he committed, he brought his own stern, philosophical morality to the conspiracy, and this led to the first of the assassins' catastrophic mistakes. During a secret meeting, Cassius argued that to secure their victory, they must not only kill Caesar, but also his powerful and popular co-consul, Mark Antony. Antony was loyal, ruthless, and politically astute. Leaving him alive, Cassius argued, was like cutting down a tree but leaving the root to sprout again. But Brutus refused. He declared that their act must be pure, a sacrifice, not a bloody purge. They were killing a tyrant, not starting a new round of civil war. "We must be sacrificers but not butchers," he famously declared. They were not to touch Antony. It was a decision born of high-minded principle, a desire to keep their hands clean of unnecessary blood. It was also a decision that would, in the end, get every single one of them killed. Their idealism had just signed their death warrants. But first, they had a tyrant to kill, and the man who knew precisely how to arrange such a thing was not the philosopher Brutus, but the pragmatic and venomous Cassius. Gaius Cassius Longinus was a man fueled by a different kind of fire. While Brutus wrestled with philosophy, Cassius was consumed by a visceral personal hatred for Caesar. The exact source of this enmity is a mystery lost to history, but its intensity was the engine that drove the conspiracy. Some said it stemmed from a professional jealousy. Cassius was a superb military commander in his own right, but his achievements were always dwarfed by Caesar's. Others whispered of a more personal slight, an insult or a rivalry that had festered for years. Whatever its origin, Cassius's hatred was pure, pragmatic, and incredibly effective. He was the recruiter, the organizer, the spy master of the plot. He understood that a successful assassination was not about ideals, but about logistics. Idealism can start a conspiracy, but only logistics can finish it. He moved through the shadowy corners of Roman high society like a weaver, pulling threads of discontent, ambition, and fear into a deadly tapestry. His recruitment process was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He didn't seek out wild-eyed radicals. He targeted respected, powerful men who had a reason, however small, to resent the dictator. There was Lucius Tullius Cimber, who was bitter because Caesar refused to pardon his exiled brother. There were the former supporters of Pompey, men Caesar had graciously pardoned, but pointedly sidelined, leaving their ambitions to wither. He brought in Gaius Trebonius and Decimus Junius Brutus, two of Caesar's most trusted generals, men who owed him everything. Their betrayal would be the most shocking, and therefore the most valuable. Cassius understood a fundamental truth about power. The most dangerous enemies are not those who hate you from the start, but those you have forgiven. Forgiveness, without a restoration of honor, is just a gilded cage. The group swelled to 60, perhaps even more. The sheer number was both a strength and a terrifying liability. How do you keep a secret among 60 Roman senators? It was a logistical nightmare. Meetings were held in scattered locations, in private homes, under the cover of darkness. Oaths were sworn, not on holy texts, but on the shared commitment to the act itself. They were a disparate group, philosophers and soldiers, debtors and patricians, united only by their presence on what would become history's most famous hit list. Cassius managed them with a blend of flattery, shared purpose, and fear. He knew that the best way to ensure loyalty was to make everyone equally guilty. Once you were in, there was no way out. The planning sessions were fraught with tension. Every detail was debated endlessly. Where should the assassination take place? The first idea was to ambush Caesar on the Via Appia as he left the city, or perhaps during the elections on the Campus Martius, where some could push him off a bridge while others finished him below. But Brutus, ever concerned with the symbolism of the act, insisted it must happen in public, in a place that represented the Republic. It had to be a political statement, not a common murder. The perfect venue was chosen, the Theatre of Pompey, a grand complex where the Senate was temporarily meeting. The symbolism was potent and dark. Caesar would be struck down at the foot of a statue of his great rival, Pompey the Great, the very man he had defeated to achieve his supreme power. The irony was as sharp as the blades they would carry. The weapon of choice was the pugio, a Roman dagger, small enough to be concealed in the scroll cases they carried or within the folds of their togas. The conspirators began carrying them everywhere, the cold weight of the steel a constant, terrifying reminder of what was to come. The tension was immense. The city was full of Caesar's spies and loyal veterans. A single misplaced word, a nervous glance, a servant's gossip could bring the whole enterprise crashing down. There were near misses. One senator, in a fit of paranoia, came to Cassius's house at dawn, grabbing his hand and whispering, "You hid the secret from me, but Brutus has told me everything." Cassius, thinking they were discovered, was plunged into icy despair until the man clarified, laughing, that he was talking about a vacant priesthood they had both been vying for. On another occasion, a senator known for his nervous disposition approached Casca, one of the key assassins, and said with a knowing smile, "You fellows have a secret, and you're keeping it well." Casca was about to panic, when the man added, "Yes, how are you going to find the money for your campaign for Aedile?" Every day was a walk on a razor's edge. They had the men, the motive, the location, and the weapons. All that was left was the date. An ancient prophecy had warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. The Ides, the 15th of the month, was just days away. For the conspirators, it was not an omen of doom, but a deadline. The perfect day to turn a prophecy into a political reality. The web was complete, every thread pulled taut. Now all they had to do was wait for the spider to walk into it. Was there an opportunity to save him? Was there a single moment when history could have pivoted, when one man's choice could have unwritten the future? The question is tantalizing. If you had the power to whisper a single word of warning in Caesar's ear, would you have done it, knowing that saving him might have condemned the Republic to a swifter, more overt death into monarchy? Or would you have stayed silent, letting the daggers fall, believing that even a bloody and chaotic freedom is better than a peaceful and orderly tyranny? This is the heart of the dilemma. The Ides of March was not just a date on the calendar, it was a crossroads in time. And as Caesar prepared for that final morning, he walked toward it utterly blind, not just to the daggers waiting for him, but to the future his death would unleash. Think about it. Was Caesar's ambition a force of nature, an unstoppable vision for a new world, or was it a simple, human hunger for power that could have been checked. Tell us in the comments what you believe drove him. Use the word vision or power to cast your vote. Your opinion is a piece of the puzzle. The night before the Ides of March was filled with omens. The heavens themselves seemed to be conspiring against Caesar. Witnesses later reported strange lights in the sky and terrifying noises in the night. The sacred horses he had set free at the Rubicon River were said to have refused to eat, weeping copious tears. A small bird, a wren carrying a laurel sprig, flew into the Curia of Pompey, only to be torn apart by a flock of larger birds. In his own home, Caesar's wife Calpurnia cried out in her sleep. She was dreaming that the gabled roof of their house had collapsed and that she was holding the mutilated body of her husband in her arms, weeping. When she awoke, she begged him not to go to the Senate that day. She was not a superstitious woman, but the dream had shaken her to her core. Caesar, a man who publicly scoffed at superstition, but privately was a deeply religious man who served as Rome's Pontifex Maximus, hesitated. He was not feeling well himself. A touch of dizziness, a recurring ailment some historians now believe, was a form of epilepsy. He considered staying home. He sent for the priests to perform a divination, a sacrifice to read the future in the entrails of an animal. The report came back. The signs were dire. The priest announced that the animal had been found to have no heart, a terrifying omen. At that moment, the fate of the world hung by a thread. Had Caesar listened to his wife, to the priests, to his own unease, he would have lived. The conspiracy would have likely unraveled in a matter of hours, and the history of the next 2,000 years would be unrecognizable. But then came the final, fatal push. The conspirators, waiting nervously at the theatre of Pompey, grew desperate when they heard Caesar was not coming. They sent one of their own, one of the men closest to Caesar, to fetch him. Decimus Junius Brutus, a man who owed Caesar his life, his career, and his vast fortune, arrived at the dictator's house. With a friendly, mocking smile, he shamed Caesar out of his caution. "What is this, Caesar?" he said. "Are you a man to be swayed by a woman's dreams and the foolish omens of priests? The Senate is waiting to honor you. They are ready to vote you king of the provinces. Will you have them told you will see them when Calpurnia has better dreams?" He played on Caesar's pride, on his fear of being seen as weak or superstitious. It worked. Caesar, shamed into action, took Decimus's hand and allowed himself to be led from the house, walking toward his own death. On his way to the Senate, the final chances to save him slipped by like ghosts. A slave who knew of the plot tried desperately to fight his way through the crowd to warn Caesar, but couldn't get close. Then came the most poignant failure of all. A Greek teacher of rhetoric named Artemidorus, who had learned the details of the conspiracy from some of his students, thrust a small papyrus scroll into Caesar's hand. "Read this, Caesar, alone and quickly," he urged. "It contains matters of great importance to you." The scroll contained a full list of the conspirators and a detailed warning of the plot. But Caesar was surrounded by petitioners and well-wishers. He tried to read it, but was constantly interrupted. He handed the scroll to a secretary to read later, placing it with his other papers. The most important message is always the one left unread. He held the key to his own salvation in his hand, and he never even looked at it. He arrived at the Curia of Pompey. As he entered, he saw the soothsayer, Spurina, the one who had first warned him to beware the Ides of March. Caesar, feeling confident now, called out to him mockingly, "Well, the Ides of March have come?" The soothsayer replied quietly, "Aye, Caesar, but not yet gone." Inside, the trap was set. The conspirators had gathered around their prey. One of them, Tilius Cimber, approached Caesar with a petition to recall his exiled brother, a prearranged signal. He knelt before Caesar, grabbing his purple toga. The others crowded in, pretending to support the petition. Caesar, annoyed, tried to wave them away. Then Cimber pulled the toga from Caesar's shoulders. It was the signal. Publius Servilius Casca, standing behind Caesar, struck the first blow. He aimed for the neck, but in his nervousness, his hand trembled. The dagger only grazed Caesar's shoulder. Caesar spun around, shocked, and cried out, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" He stabbed Casca in the arm with his stylus, the sharp metal pen he used for writing. For a moment, it seemed the 59-year-old dictator, a veteran of countless battles, might fight his way out. But it was only a moment. The others fell upon him in a frenzy, a whirlwind of flashing steel and grim-faced men. He saw faces he knew, men he had promoted, men he had pardoned. Daggers stabbed at him from every direction. He pulled his toga up over his head, not to shield himself from the blows, but to hide his face, to die with dignity. He staggered, blinded by his own blood, until he fell at the base of the great statue of his vanquished rival, Pompey. It was said that as he saw Marcus Brutus, his protege, his friend, perhaps even his son, approach with his dagger raised, he uttered his final, heartbreaking words. Accounts differ. The Roman historian Suetonius claims he said in Greek, "Kai su teknon," "You too, my child?" Shakespeare, centuries later, would immortalize the Latin version, "Et tu, Brute?" "You too, Brutus?" Most likely, he said nothing at all. What could be said in the face of such a profound betrayal? He fell, bleeding from 23 wounds, though only one to the chest was fatal. And then silence, a deafening, profound silence, broken only by the sound of dripping blood. The great Caesar was dead. The liberators, as they called themselves, stood panting, their daggers dripping red, their hands stained with the blood of the man who had been the master of the world just moments before. They had done it. They had killed the tyrant. And in that moment of bloody triumph, they believed they had saved the Republic. They could not have been more wrong. The silence that followed the final blow was not the silence of awe. It was the silence of pure, unadulterated terror. The senators who were not part of the plot, who had just witnessed the most powerful man in the world butchered before their very eyes, scrambled for the exits. They fled in a mad panic, stumbling over one another, convinced that the slaughter had only just begun and that they were next. This was the conspirators' second catastrophic mistake, a miscalculation born of astounding political naivete. They had imagined this moment so differently. In their minds, once the tyrant was slain, the rest of the Senate would rise as one, cheering their names, thanking them for restoring liberty. They expected to be hailed as heroes, as the saviors of Rome. Brutus, his hands and toga smeared with Caesar's blood, raised his dagger high and tried to make a speech. He called out to Cicero, the great orator, by name, hoping to enlist his moral authority. But no one was listening. The chamber was empty, save for the assassins and the cooling corpse at their feet. The liberators stood alone, drenched in blood, in a silent room. Their grand act of liberation had been met not with applause, but with a stampede. What is more frightening, the tyranny of one man or the anarchy born from the hands of his assassins. The conspirators were about to find out that Rome, having forgotten the reality of freedom, was far more terrified of the chaos they had just unleashed. Outside, the panic spread through the city like a plague. Rumors flew faster than facts. Caesar has been murdered. The Senate is being slaughtered. Gaulish legions are marching on the city. Shopkeepers slammed their wooden shutters, families barred their doors, and the streets of the world's most crowded metropolis became eerily deserted. The people of Rome did not rush into the forum to celebrate their newfound freedom. They ran home to hide. This was not the reaction Brutus and Cassius had planned for. Their plan for freedom had a beginning, the death of Caesar, but it had no middle and no end. They had no strategy for what to do next, for how to manage the power vacuum they had just created. Believing the rightness of their cause would be self-evident, they had made no provision for seizing control of the state. So they did the only thing they could think of: Marching together in a tight defensive formation, their bloody daggers still held aloft, they made their way from the Curia of Pompeii up to the Capitoline Hill, the ancient citadel of Rome. They shouted freedom and liberty to the empty streets. They were a parade with no spectators. Reaching the fortified hill, they hunkered down, confused and increasingly fearful. They expected the city's elite to flock to their banner. Instead, they found themselves isolated, fugitives in the very city they believed they had saved. While the assassins were trying to figure out their next move, two men were already making theirs. Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, his master of the horse, were men of action, not philosophy. Hearing the news, Antony had the presence of mind to disguise himself as a slave and flee to his home. Lepidus, whose legion was camped on an island in the Tiber, moved his troops into the city, securing the forum. The power vacuum was already beginning to be filled, and not by the men who had created it. Down from the Capitoline Hill, Brutus made another attempt to win over the people. He descended into the forum to give a speech. It was a carefully reasoned philosophical argument explaining in calm, rational terms why Caesar had to die for the good of the Republic. He spoke of liberty, tradition, and the rule of law. The crowd that had cautiously gathered listened in stony, unnerving silence. They were not convinced. They had loved Caesar. He had given them victories, spectacles, and, most importantly, stability. To the common Roman, the abstract ideals of senatorial liberty meant little compared to the grain dole and the promise of peace Caesar had provided. When another, more fiery conspirator began to speak and mentioned the hated name of the old kings, the crowd's silence turned to angry muttering. The speech was a disaster. Brutus and the others retreated back to the safety of the Capitoline, the realization of their failure beginning to dawn on them. They had killed Caesar, but his spirit, his popularity with the people, was still very much alive, and it was about to be given a voice. Mark Antony, having recovered from his initial shock, saw his opportunity. He held the two most powerful cards in the game. He was the legally elected consul and, even more importantly, he had possession of Caesar's will. The assassins had killed a man, but Antony was about to resurrect a martyr. And with that martyr's last testament, he would burn their dream of a restored republic to the ground. The silence was over. The storm was about to break. The 2 days following the assassination were a masterclass in political maneuvering, and the Grandmaster was Mark Antony. He emerged from hiding not as a vengeful subordinate, but as a statesman, a voice of reason in a city teetering on the edge of chaos. He convened the Senate, not the shell-shocked rump that had fled the Curia, but a formal session held under the watchful eyes of his soldiers. He brokered a compromise that was a work of diabolical genius. On the one hand, he proposed a general amnesty for the assassins. There would be no prosecutions, no revenge. This placated the nervous conspirators and their many sympathizers in the Senate. On the other hand, he insisted that all of Caesar's acts and appointments must be ratified and his will read publicly. To oppose this would be to delegitimize the positions of many senators, including many of the assassins themselves, whom Caesar had appointed. It was a brilliant trap. The Senate, desperate to avoid civil war, agreed. The assassins were pardoned, and they came down from the Capitoline, believing they had won. Brutus even dined with Cassius that night. They thought the crisis was over. In reality, Antony had just handed them a poisoned chalice. He had saved them from prosecution only so he could destroy them with politics. The real battle for Rome would be fought not with daggers, but with words, over the body of the man they had just killed. The stage was set for Caesar's funeral in the Roman Forum. This was to be Antony's theatre. He knew he couldn't openly attack Brutus and Cassius. The amnesty was still in effect. He had to turn the people against them to make the city itself demand vengeance. First, a wax effigy of Caesar was carried into the Forum, a gruesome, lifelike figure meticulously painted to show all 23 wounds. It was mounted on a revolving mechanism, so the horrified crowd could see the butchery from every angle. Then came the eulogy. Antony began his speech with a stunning display of false humility and biting irony. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," he began. "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." He spoke of Brutus as an honorable man, repeating the phrase again and again, each time infusing it with more sarcasm, more venom, until the words themselves began to mean their opposite. He didn't have to call the assassins traitors. He made the crowd think it for themselves. He reminded the people of Caesar's victories, the treasure he brought to Rome, the captives he ransomed. He recalled the moment at the Lupercalia when Caesar had refused the crown, asking, "Was this ambition?" He masterfully painted a picture of a benevolent leader, a true father of his people, struck down by envious, ungrateful men. The crowd, which had been sullen and quiet, began to stir. Their grief was turning to anger. Then came the masterstroke. Antony produced Caesar's will. The assassins had made their third and perhaps most fatal mistake. They had never bothered to read it. Antony announced to the stunned crowd that Caesar, the tyrant, the ambitious monster, had left a staggering sum of money, 300 sesterces, to every single man, woman, and child in Rome. More than that, he had bequeathed his vast, beautiful private gardens on the other side of the Tiber to the people as a public park, forever. It was an act of incredible generosity, a final gift from their murdered patron. The effect was electric. The crowd erupted. This was not the will of a tyrant, it was the will of a father. Their grief exploded into a volcanic rage. Antony, seizing the moment, strode over to Caesar's bier and, in a final dramatic flourish, ripped the covering off the corpse. He held up the bloody torn toga Caesar had worn, pointing to each rip and gash. "Look, in this place ran Cassius's dagger through," he cried. "See what a rent the envious Casca made! Through this, the well-beloved Brutus stabbed." The sight of the mutilated body, combined with the news of the will, drove the crowd into a frenzy. They became a mob. They seized torches from the funeral pyre, screaming for revenge. They surged through the forum looking for the assassins. They stormed the houses of Brutus and Cassius, who were forced to flee for their lives. The city exploded into riots. In their fury, the mob even made a tragic mistake, seizing an innocent poet named Cinna, mistaking him for one of the conspirators with the same name, and tearing him limb from limb in the street. Antony had won. In a single afternoon, with a single speech, he had turned the liberators into fugitives and himself into the master of Rome. The republic Brutus had killed Caesar to save was now at the mercy of an enraged mob and an ambitious general. But even as Antony savored his victory, a new player was entering the game. A sickly 19-year-old boy studying in Greece had just learned that he was Caesar's adopted son and principal heir. His name was Gaius Octavius, but history would come to know him as Octavian, and later as Augustus. The game for Caesar's inheritance had just begun, and it would be played for the highest possible stakes, the world itself. The dream of a restored republic, born in blood and philosophy, died in the fire and fury of the Roman mob. Brutus and Cassius, along with the other liberators, were forced to scatter, fleeing Italy under a cloud of public hatred. They were no longer saviors, they were murderers on the run. Their high-minded act of tyrannicide had backfired so spectacularly that it had transformed them into the very thing they had sought to destroy. To survive, they would have to become military autocrats, provincial warlords raising armies to fight for their lives and their dying cause. They made their way east to the wealthy provinces of Greece, Macedonia, and Syria. These were the lands once conquered by Pompey the Great, and sympathies for the old republican cause ran deep among the local elites. Here, Brutus and Cassius began the grim work of assembling an army. They were no longer senators debating law, they were generals imposing taxes, requisitioning supplies, and conscripting soldiers. Brutus, the Stoic philosopher who had argued against political purges, found himself plundering cities in Asia Minor to fill his war chest. Cassius, with his customary ruthless efficiency, squeezed the provinces so hard that some communities chose mass suicide over submitting to his extortion. They even began minting coins, a clear sign of sovereign power. One famous silver denarius issued by Brutus showed a pileus, the cap of a freed slave, between two daggers with the inscription Aid Mar, the Ides of March. It was a piece of propaganda celebrating the murder, a defiant cry that their cause was still just. They were fighting for libertas, for freedom, but their methods were those of the tyrants they despised. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the political landscape had shifted again, becoming darker and more treacherous. The meteoric rise of Caesar's young heir, Octavian, had changed everything. Initially, Mark Antony had dismissed the boy as a political lightweight, contemptuously refusing to hand over Caesar's fortune. But Octavian proved to be a prodigy of cunning and ruthless ambition. He used his famous name to rally Caesar's loyal veterans to his side, creating a powerful private army. He played the Senate against Antony, positioning himself as the defender of the Republic, even as he was plotting its final destruction. A temporary and violent alliance formed between the Senate and Octavian against Antony, leading to a brief, vicious war in northern Italy. Antony was defeated and declared a public enemy. For a fleeting moment it seemed Cicero's dream of a restored republic, with Octavian as its loyal soldier, might come true. But Octavian had no intention of being anyone's pawn. In a stunning reversal, he marched his legions on Rome, forced the Senate to declare him consul, and then did the unthinkable. He met with his rival, Mark Antony, and Caesar's other loyal general, Lepidus. On a small island in a river near Bononia, the three most powerful men in Rome made a deal. They would put aside their differences and unite to hunt down and destroy their common enemies, the assassins of Caesar. They formed a new political entity, a three-man dictatorship officially sanctioned by law, which history would call the Second Triumvirate. Their first order of business was to make their power absolute and to fill their coffers for the coming war against Brutus and Cassius. They did this with an instrument of pure state terror, the prescriptions. The prescriptions were not just a list of enemies, they were a death warrant for the Roman Republic itself. The triumvirs, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, drew up lists of their political and personal enemies. These lists were posted publicly in the forum. Anyone whose name was on the list was declared an outlaw. They could be hunted down and killed by anyone, with no trial. Their property was confiscated by the state, and the person who killed them received a handsome reward. It was a declaration of open season on the Roman elite. The terror that descended upon Rome was absolute. It was a time of unimaginable cruelty when all the bonds of society dissolved. Sons betrayed fathers to inherit their property early. Wives betrayed husbands. Slaves betrayed masters for the promise of freedom and a share of the reward. Bounty hunters roamed the streets carrying severed heads to the triumvirs' headquarters to claim their blood money. It was a slaughter driven by greed as much as by politics. Hundreds of senators and thousands of equestrians, the wealthy business class, were murdered. Their crime was not necessarily that they had supported the assassins, but simply that they were rich. The triumvirate needed money for its legions, and this was the quickest, most brutal way to get it. They were financing their war for justice with a campaign of legalized robbery and murder. All the ideals that Brutus had spoken of, law, virtue, freedom, had become a sick joke. The Republic was drowning in a sea of its own blood, and the men who claimed to be avenging Caesar were proving to be infinitely more tyrannical than he had ever been. Among the thousands of names on that list, one stood out, a symbol of the Republic's final agony: Marcus Tullius Cicero. If you were a Roman senator during this time of terror, faced with an impossible choice, what would you do? The liberators in the East offer a dangerous hope, a war for an ideal that could cost you everything, including your life and your family's fortune. In Rome, the triumvirs offer a brutal, bloody peace, a chance to keep your head down and perhaps survive. Would you risk it all for a principle, or would you compromise to protect your own? This is not a question of history. It is a question of human nature. Tell us your choice in the comments below. Would you have chosen the path of resistance or the path of survival? Let the debate rage. Marcus Tullius Cicero was the Republic's greatest orator, its most passionate defender, and, in his final days, its most prominent martyr. He had been the conscience of Rome for decades, a man who believed, perhaps more than anyone, in the power of law and reason over the rule of the sword. He had despised Caesar's tyranny but had been horrified by his murder, seeing it not as a solution but as a catalyst for more violence. In the chaotic months after the Ides of March, Cicero had placed his hopes in the young Octavian, believing he could mold the boy into a champion of the Senate against the ambitions of Mark Antony. He had unleashed the full power of his legendary eloquence against Antony, delivering a series of blistering speeches known as the Philippics, which painted Antony as a drunken, degenerate tyrant and a public enemy. It was Cicero's finest hour as an orator, and it was also his death sentence. When the triumvirs met to draw up their prescription lists, Antony's price for the alliance was absolute: Cicero's life. Octavian, the boy Cicero had mentored and promoted, owed his entire political career to the old orator. He reportedly resisted for 2 days, but in the end, ambition trumped loyalty. He traded the life of his benefactor for political gain. He handed Cicero over to Antony's vengeance. The story of Cicero's final days is a microcosm of the Republic's collapse. Warned that his name was on the list, he tried to flee Italy by sea, but foul weather and his own fatalistic indecision drove him back to his villa. He was old, tired, and weary of a world where his ideals no longer had any meaning. "Let me die in the fatherland which I have so often saved," he reportedly told his loyal slaves as the bounty hunters closed in. When the soldiers arrived, led by a centurion whose life Cicero had once saved in court, his slaves wanted to fight, but Cicero forbade it. He calmly stepped out of the litter in which he was being carried, stretched out his neck, and met his fate. The soldiers cut off his head, and on Antony's specific orders, his hands, the hands that had written the speeches that had so viciously attacked him. Antony's wife, Fulvia, who held a personal grudge against Cicero, is said to have taken the severed head, placed it on her lap, and, pulling out its tongue, repeatedly stabbed it with one of her hairpins, a final, grotesque act of vengeance against the words that had tormented her husband. The head and hands were then taken back to Rome and nailed to the rostra, the public speaking platform in the Forum where Cicero had delivered his greatest speeches. The horrifying display served as a warning to all. This is what happens to the enemies of the new regime. The voice of the Republic had been silenced, its severed hands a grisly testament to the death of free speech. The prescriptions had achieved their purpose. The triumvir's treasury was full, and their opposition in Rome was either dead or terrified into silence. Now they could turn their full attention eastward. With an enormous army funded by the blood and treasure of slaughtered citizens, Antony and Octavian crossed the Adriatic Sea into Greece. They were coming to finish the war that had begun with 23 dagger strikes in the Curia of Pompey. Brutus and Cassius had gathered their own formidable force, 19 legions strong, an army of Romans, Greeks, and Eastern allies. They were encamped near the ancient city of Philippi in Macedonia, controlling the high ground, with a strong defensive position and a direct supply line to the sea. They had every military advantage. Their strategy was simple: avoid a direct confrontation, use their superior position to harass the triumvir's army, and wait for their enemy's supplies to run out. It was a sound, cautious plan, but war is not just about strategy. It is about morale, fate, and ghosts. The night before the armies were to engage, a legend was born that would haunt the final days of the Republic. Brutus, sitting late in his tent, studying maps by the dim light of a lamp, was said to have been visited by a terrifying apparition. A tall, shadowy figure appeared before him. Brutus, ever the stoic, calmly asked, "What are you, a man or a god, and what is your business with me?" The spectre replied with a hollow voice, I am your evil genius, Brutus. You shall see me at Philippi." Brutus, unshaken, simply answered, "Then I shall see you." The ghost of Caesar, it seemed, had come to keep an appointment. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin on the plains of Philippi. The souls of the dead were gathering to watch the final bloody end of the world they had known. The Battle of Philippi was not one battle, but two, fought 3 weeks apart. It was a sprawling, chaotic, and brutal affair, the final death spasm of the Roman Republic. The two largest Roman armies ever to face each other were arrayed on the plains of Macedonia, and the fate of their world rested on the outcome. The first battle, in early October of 42 BC, was a confused and desperate struggle. On one flank, Brutus's legions, fighting with incredible ferocity, smashed into Octavian's forces. They overran his camp, sending the young triumvir fleeing for his life. Brutus had won a decisive victory on his side of the field, but on the other flank, disaster struck. Cassius's legions, facing the veteran forces of Mark Antony, were driven back. Cassius, watching from a hill, saw a cloud of dust in the distance. A scout reported that Brutus's camp was being overrun. In despair, mistakenly believing that all was lost and that his friend Brutus was defeated, Cassius made a fatal decision. The pragmatist, the man who had been the logistical genius of the conspiracy, lost his nerve. He turned to his loyal freedman and ordered the man to kill him with the same dagger he had used to strike Caesar. His final words were a lament that he had lived to see his best friend captured by the enemy. The irony was devastating. The dust cloud he had seen was not the enemy, it was Brutus's cavalry riding to tell him of their victory. He had died because of a tragic mistake, a victim of the fog of war. When Brutus found his body, he wept, calling him the last of the Romans. He had lost his friend and the sharpest military mind on his side. The death of Cassius was a devastating blow to the morale of the Republican army. Brutus, now in sole command, tried to rally his men. He managed to hold the line for another 3 weeks, but the tide had turned. The triumvir's forces, now controlling the battlefield, were able to cut off his supply lines. His soldiers grew restless and undisciplined, demanding another pitched battle. Against his better judgment, Brutus was forced to commit to a second, final confrontation. The second battle, fought on the same ground, was a straightforward slaughter. Brutus's demoralized legions were no match for the combined forces of Antony and Octavian. His lines broke, and his army was routed. Brutus himself managed to escape with a few companions into the nearby hills. As night fell, he knew there was no hope. The cause was lost. The Republic was dead, and he was its last true defender. He spent his final hours speaking with his friends, his mind still clear, his courage unwavering. He did not rail against fate or curse his enemies. He spoke of philosophy and virtue. He asked one of his companions to hold his sword for him so he could fall upon it. His friend refused. He asked another. Finally, his old friend Strato agreed, turning his face away as Brutus ran himself through. According to the historian Plutarch, his last words were not a lament for himself, but for the ideal he had died for. "O wretched virtue, you were but a name, and yet I worshipped you as a real thing. But now, it seems, you were only a slave to fortune." With his death, the last flicker of Republican liberty was extinguished. The war that had begun on the Ides of March was over. The liberators were all dead. But the peace they had died to prevent was not the peace of a restored republic, but the silence of a graveyard, ruled by new masters who were about to turn on each other. The ghost of Caesar could finally rest. His assassins were dead, their armies scattered. But the curse of his murder was not yet complete. The assassination had been committed to prevent one man from ruling Rome. The catastrophic irony is that it set in motion a chain of events that made one man rule inevitable. The power vacuum created by Caesar's death was so vast, and the subsequent civil wars so devastating, that the exhausted Roman world no longer craved liberty. It craved peace at any price. The idea of the Republic, for which Brutus and Cassius had sacrificed everything, was now a hollow memory associated not with freedom, but with chaos, prescription, and endless war. The victors at Philippi, Mark Antony and Octavian, were the masters of this new world, but their alliance, forged in the heat of revenge, was a partnership of rivals. There was not enough room in the world for two masters. They divided the Roman territories between them, with Antony taking the wealthy, glamorous East, and Octavian taking the troublesome, difficult West, including Italy. It was a division that was destined to fail. The final act of the drama that began on the Ides of March would be played out between these two men, the chief avengers of Caesar, now transformed into his ultimate successors. One was a brilliant, hard-drinking, charismatic general in the traditional mold. The other was a cold, calculating political genius. It was a clash of styles, of ambitions, and ultimately of destinies. The final conflict was ignited by Antony's fateful alliance with the last queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. In her, Antony found not only a lover but a political partner with ambitions as vast as his own. Together they dreamed of a new Hellenistic empire in the East, with its capital at Alexandria, a vision that was anathema to the traditions of Rome. Octavian, back in Italy, seized on this as a brilliant propaganda opportunity. He painted Antony not as a Roman rival, but as a traitor, a decadent slave to a foreign queen who threatened the very existence of Rome. He illegally obtained Antony's will and read it to the Senate, revealing Antony's plans to be buried in Alexandria and his donations of Roman provinces to his children with Cleopatra. This was the final outrage. The Senate declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a political masterstroke, framing a Roman civil war as a foreign crusade. The final confrontation came in 31 BC at the great naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. The battle was a decisive victory for Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant general Marcus Agrippa. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, their forces defeated, their dream in ruins. A year later, as Octavian's legions closed in on Alexandria, Antony, hearing a false report of Cleopatra's death, committed suicide by falling on his sword. Cleopatra, after a final defiant meeting with Octavian, took her own life, famously by the bite of an asp, rather than be paraded as a captive in a Roman triumph. With Antony dead, the 19-year-old boy who had been a sickly student when Caesar was murdered was now, at the age of 33, the undisputed sole master of the Roman world. The century of civil wars was finally over. Octavian had won. But he was too intelligent to make Caesar's mistake. He knew that Rome was not ready to accept the title of king. So, in an act of supreme political theatre, he went before the Senate in 27 BC and announced that he was restoring the Republic. He claimed to be giving up his extraordinary powers and returning control to the Senate and the people of Rome. The grateful senators, terrified of a return to chaos, begged him to stay. They showered him with honors, giving him the new name Augustus, the revered or illustrious one. They named him Princeps, or first citizen. It was all a carefully constructed fiction. Behind the facade of the restored republic, Augustus held all the real power. He controlled the army, the treasury, and the provinces. He ruled as an absolute monarch, but with the consent of the governed, who were simply grateful for the peace. The assassination of Julius Caesar, an act designed to save the republic, had been the very thing that destroyed it. By killing one man who might have become king, the assassins had paved the way for another man to become a god. The final bitter irony is that Caesar got his ultimate revenge. His name became a title, Kaiser, Tsar, a synonym for absolute power for the next 2,000 years. And his adopted son, Octavian Augustus, founded an empire on the ruins of the Republic that would last for 500 years in the West and another 1,000 in the East. Brutus killed a man to save an idea, but in the end, he destroyed both. His act became history's greatest lesson, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Now, a question for our own turbulent times. What do you believe is the greater danger to a society, the absolute power of a single, decisive leader, or the chaotic and often violent disagreement of a free-for-all democracy? Your answer defines the world you want to live in. Share your thoughts below.